The starlit void of space was a silent witness to the chaos unfolding within the small, hurtling spacecraft. Jack Manning gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white as the console flickered with urgent warnings. "System failure. Initiating emergency landing protocol," announced the ship's AI, its voice unnervingly calm amidst the cacophony of alarms. "Great, just what I needed," Jack muttered, scanning the horizon of the alien planet approaching fast beneath him. "Find me a spot that isn't going to turn me into space dust, would you?" Identifying a suitable landing zone. Brace for impact. The craft shuddered violently as it breached the planet's atmosphere, flames engulfing its exterior as it descended at a terrifying speed. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his focus absolute as he maneuvered the ship toward a clearing in the dense alien jungle that spread out like a sea of green below. With a deafening crash that echoed through the forest, the spacecraft tore through the foliage before coming to a bone-jarring halt. The cockpit was a mess of sparks and smoldering circuits. Jack unbuckled his harness and stumbled out of his seat, wincing as he clutched his side. "Okay, not my smoothest landing," he grunted, surveying the damage. The ship was grounded, irreparable without help. He needed to assess his injuries and find a way to communicate with any possible rescue team. As he activated the emergency medical kit, a noise outside caught his attention, a rustling in the dense underbrush. Jack froze, reaching slowly for the blaster holstered at his side. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm despite the throbbing pain in his ribs. Out of the shadows stepped an alien, unlike any human, tall and slender with luminescent skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light filtering through the canopy. The alien held up its hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," it said, its voice melodic and soothing. Jack eyed the newcomer warily. "You speak English?" "I am Lyra," the alien responded, ignoring his question. "I heard your vessel. It is badly damaged. You are hurt. We must get you to safety." Jack lowered his weapon slightly, assessing his options. There's more of you." Lyra nodded, stepping back to beckon him. "My people can help you. But we must hurry. This area is not safe at night." Reluctantly, Jack followed, his steps unsteady. As they walked, Lyra spoke of her people, the Ataraxians, who avoided the conflicts that plagued other worlds, choosing instead a life of seclusion and healing. "Your arrival will cause complications," Lyra admitted. "But we honor the sanctity of life above all." Despite the pain, Jack couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. "Sounds like you've got stories to tell." Lyra smiled, a glow emanating from her eyes. "Many, Jack Manning. And perhaps, in time, you will share yours as well." Together, they disappeared into the foliage, the wreckage of the spacecraft a silent testament to the unexpected journey ahead. Chapter 2. The Alien Healer. Jack stirred slowly, blinking as his vision focused on a bright, unfamiliar light above him. His body felt heavy, his muscles sluggish. As his senses sharpened, he became aware of a sterile yet calming scent, like a mix of wildflowers and citrus, and the faint hum of machinery. "Ah, you're awake," a gentle voice said, startling him. Jack turned his head to see a tall figure leaning over him. Lyra's luminescent skin glowed softly under the pale lights of the room. Her eyes, larger than any human's, studied him with a mix of concern and curiosity. Standing next to her was another figure, equally tall but more broad-shouldered, with a sharper, angular jawline. He had the same shimmering skin as Lyra, though his was a deep silver rather than her warm blue. "This is Cale," Lyra said, gesturing to her companion. "He will assist me in your recovery." Cale inclined his head but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Jack attempted to sit up, but Lyra gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not yet. You're still healing. You were injured when your vessel crashed." "How bad is it?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. "Severe, but manageable," Lyra replied. "Your bones are knitting, your internal bleeding has stopped, and the burns are responding to treatment. However, you must rest for the process to complete." Cale finally spoke, his voice deeper than Lyra's but calm. "Your physiology is unlike anything we have encountered. You humans have a remarkable stamina." He hesitated on the word, as if unsure it was the right one. "It is both fascinating and perplexing." "Yeah, we get that a lot," Jack said with a weak smile. "I appreciate the help, though. I wasn't sure what to expect when I saw you out there." "You would have perished without intervention," Lyra said plainly. "Our technology can heal wounds your own kind might deem fatal. But you must trust us and remain still." Jack frowned, the reality of his situation sinking in. "So, I'm stuck here until I'm fully patched up?" Lyra nodded. "Yes. It would be unwise to leave before your body has stabilized." Cale moved to a panel on the wall, his long fingers brushing over glowing symbols that Jack couldn't decipher. A faint humming grew louder, and Jack felt a warm, tingling sensation spread through his limbs. "What are you doing?" Jack asked, his body tense. "Enhancing the healing process," Cale replied. "This field stimulates cellular regeneration. It will not harm you." Jack relaxed slightly, though the alien technology still unnerved him. "Okay. So, what's the plan after that? Do I just walk out of here and head back to my ship?" Lyra exchanged a glance with Cale before responding. "That may not be possible. Your vessel sustained heavy damage. We have begun assessing it, but it is likely beyond repair." "Great," Jack muttered, rubbing his temple. "So what do I do? Build a new ship out of tree branches and hope for the best?" Cale raised an eyebrow, a gesture that seemed universal. "You misunderstand. We will not abandon you. We have resources, but it will take time. Until then, you remain under our care." Jack sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "So I'm your patient and your guest. Guess I'll have to get used to it." "You will find we are not unkind hosts," Lyra said softly. She stepped closer, placing her hand briefly on his. Her touch was cool but comforting. "Rest now. Cale and I will ensure you have everything you need." Jack lay back, his body surrendering to the warmth spreading from the alien device. Despite his situation, he couldn't help but feel a faint curiosity about these beings who had saved him. Before he drifted off again, he heard Cale's voice, low and steady. "If nothing else, human, you should know this. You are safe here." Jack's lips twitched in a half-smile as his eyes closed. Safe wasn't a word he'd heard in a long time. Chapter 3. Language of Healing. Jack sat upright on the firm but comfortable bed, looking around the softly glowing chamber. The walls seemed alive, pulsing faintly with light patterns that Jack suspected weren't merely decorative. Lyra stood beside him, her hands busy at a console projecting holographic images of Jack's internal anatomy. Beside her, Cale studied the display, his silver-toned features unreadable as he analyzed the data. "Your body's response to our treatment is better than expected," Lyra said, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and satisfaction. "We were uncertain how your species would react, but the improvements are substantial." "Good to know I'm not dying anymore," Jack quipped, though his voice carried more gratitude than sarcasm. Cale tilted his head toward Lyra. His humor. It is an interesting trait. Even in discomfort, he deflects with amusement. "Yeah, it's kind of our thing," Jack said. Laugh at the abyss, or it swallows you whole. Lyra looked thoughtful. A curious philosophy, but perhaps useful. Jack shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. So, what now? I'm patched up, more or less, and I'm not exactly keen on sitting here twiddling my thumbs. Is there something I can do to help? Or at least keep busy? Lyra glanced at Cale, who shrugged slightly before responding. We will need to refine the calibration of our treatment devices. If you are able, you can assist us in understanding how your body reacts. It would benefit not only you, but perhaps others of your kind in the future. Great, Jack said, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. I'm not a doctor, but I'm happy to play guinea pig if it means getting off this bed. Cale crossed his arms, his silver skin glinting faintly under the room's ambient light. Before we proceed, you must understand that our methods are not merely mechanical. We combine biological knowledge with a deeper understanding of how living systems interact. It requires cooperation. You mean like teamwork? Jack replied. Yeah, I think I can manage that. Lyra smiled faintly. Then let us begin. If you experience any discomfort or unusual sensations, inform us immediately. Jack stood, testing his weight on his legs. They felt surprisingly strong, considering the state he'd been in not long ago. He followed Lyra and Cale to another chamber, this one larger and lined with intricate arrays of lights and symbols. A central platform rose slightly from the floor, its surface covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift as they approached. Step onto the platform, Lyra instructed. We will run a series of diagnostics and compare them to your earlier readings. Jack complied, his boots clicking against the smooth surface. This doesn't feel too different from the med scanners we use back home. Just fancier. Cale touched a control panel, and the patterns beneath Jack's feet began to glow. A gentle hum filled the room, and Jack felt a warmth spreading through his body. It wasn't unpleasant, more like standing in sunlight on a mild day. Everything seems stable, Lyra said, studying the floating readouts. You may feel a slight tingling. That is normal. Yeah, I feel it, Jack said. Kind of weird, but not bad. Cale glanced at him. Your body is adjusting to our environment as well. The energy fields here are not the same as your world's, but you seem to adapt quickly. Jack grinned. Adaptation is kind of our specialty. Lyra turned her gaze from the console to Jack. Your species must possess significant ingenuity to have reached this place. I admit, when I first encountered you, I was skeptical you would survive. I get that a lot, Jack said. But we don't go down easy. Cale stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the displays. We should test his coordination. If his internal structures are stable, he should be able to move without strain. Coordination? What do you mean? Jack asked. Simple exercises, Cale said. Follow my lead. The tall alien demonstrated a series of movements, lifting his arms, rotating his torso, stepping in place. Jack mimicked him, feeling his body respond with surprising ease. After a few minutes, Jack chuckled. Not bad, he said. I could almost dance. Cale raised an eyebrow. A form of movement for enjoyment, yes? Jack nodded. More or less. It's just nice to feel like I'm not falling apart anymore. Lyra smiled again, that subtle expression that hinted at her curiosity and growing respect. Your progress is encouraging. If you continue to improve, we can move on to more complex tasks. For now, rest and rehydrate. As Jack stepped down from the platform, he noticed a change in Cale's usually stoic demeanor. The silver-toned alien appeared less aloof, almost as if he were beginning to understand Jack's perspective. "You mentioned teamwork," Cale said. "I am unfamiliar with humans, but I see now that cooperation between us might lead to greater results. Perhaps we can learn from each other." "That's the idea," Jack said, offering a hand. Cale hesitated for a moment before clasping it briefly, his grip firm but not unfriendly. Lyra watched the exchange with interest. "This is promising. If we can bridge the gap between our ways, it will benefit us both." "Sounds good to me," Jack said. "Let's keep moving forward." With a shared understanding taking root, the trio left the chamber, their next steps carrying them closer to something neither human nor alien could have foreseen. Chapter 4. Forbidden Knowledge. Jack trailed behind Lyra and Cale as they entered a circular room filled with shimmering panels of light. The air hummed with quiet energy, and a vast dome stretched overhead, its surface rippling with faint, flowing patterns. Jack couldn't tell if it was made of metal, crystal, or something else entirely. "This is our archive," Lyra said, motioning for him to step closer. "Here, we preserve the knowledge of our people, spanning generations." Jack let out a low whistle. "So, what, you've got your whole civilization's history just floating in the air?" Lyra smiled faintly. "In a manner of speaking. We don't store our knowledge the way you might. Our technology interfaces directly with our thoughts and memories. It's a more organic process." "Sounds intense," Jack said, gazing at the shifting images. They reminded him of flowing water, though each wave revealed fragments of images, landscapes, cities, unfamiliar faces. Cale stepped forward, placing his hand on one of the glowing panels. A set of symbols appeared, spiraling outward before settling into a single image, a towering structure with an intricate latticework design. "This is one of our oldest known constructs," Cale said. "It was built long before we reached our current state of technological understanding." "Looks like it belongs in a sci-fi movie," Jack said, crossing his arms. "What's it made of?" Cale considered the question. "A material unique to our world. Its exact composition would be unfamiliar to you, but it serves as a conduit for energy and data. It was our first step toward achieving what we call integrancy, the seamless merging of all aspects of life." "That's a fancy word," Jack said. "What does it mean in practice?" Lyra turned to him. "It's not just about technology. Integrancy reflects our belief that all things are interconnected. Our actions, our environment, even our thoughts and memories are part of a larger whole. We strive to maintain that balance in all we do." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out." Cale's lips twitched in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. "Not entirely. There have been mistakes, conflicts. We are not perfect." "So you're not as serene as you seem," Jack said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Good to know." Lyra touched another panel, and a new set of images appeared, scenes of their people engaged in various tasks. Some worked in lush gardens, cultivating plants that glowed softly under their touch. Others stood before crystalline interfaces, their hands moving in precise patterns as the structures responded with bursts of light. "This is how we heal," Lyra explained, gesturing to one particular image. "Our methods combine biological understanding with the natural energies of our world. It's a practice that took centuries to perfect." "Centuries, huh?" Jack muttered. "Humans tend to rush things a bit more." "That much is evident," Cale said, his tone neutral. "Your species has achieved remarkable feats in a relatively short time, though not without cost." Jack folded his arms, eyeing Cale. "Not a fan of humanity, are you?" Cale held his gaze. "It's not a matter of preference. I simply find your approach unconventional. But that does not mean it lacks merit. High praise coming from you, Jack said with a smirk. Lyra stepped between them, her voice calm. This is not a competition. We are here to share knowledge, to learn from each other. Sure, but let's be honest, Jack said. Your people seem to have all the answers. What could you possibly learn from us? Lyra regarded him thoughtfully. Curiosity, determination, the ability to adapt in ways we would never consider. These are qualities we do not fully understand, and yet they have brought you to us. Jack was about to respond when another image caught his eye. This one was darker, showing a barren landscape dotted with crumbling structures. A faint glow pulsed within the ruins, hinting at some forgotten energy source. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Cale's expression turned grim. "A place we no longer visit. It is a remnant of our past mistakes, a time when we lost sight of our values." "Your values?" Jack asked. "You mean this integrancy thing?" "Yes," Lyra said quietly. "Before we embraced it, we pursued progress without considering the consequences. It nearly destroyed us. We learned to listen to the connections that bind us, to each other, to our environment, to our own thoughts. Only then did we begin to heal." Jack nodded slowly. "Sounds like a hard lesson." "It was," Cale said. "But it shaped who we are now. That is why we are willing to share our knowledge with you, even if it means taking risks." Jack turned back to the glowing panels, his mind racing. The room was filled with more knowledge than he could ever process, a tapestry of experiences and ideas unlike anything he'd seen before. Yet beneath all the talk of balance and connection, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still much they weren't telling him. Chapter 5. The Expedition. Jack adjusted the shoulder strap of the satchel Lyra had given him, scanning the dense forest ahead. The jungle was unlike anything he'd encountered before. Trees with translucent leaves, flowers that emitted soft glows, and faint whispers of unseen creatures rustling through the underbrush. "Are you sure this path is safe?" he asked, glancing at Cale, who was walking a few steps ahead, tall and silent as ever. "Safe enough," Cale replied. "We have traveled this route before." "Comforting," Jack muttered, stepping carefully over a thick vine. "You know, I've never been a fan of giant forests filled with alien wildlife. I keep expecting something to jump out and eat me." Lyra, who was just behind Jack, laughed lightly. "The creatures here are not as dangerous as they appear. Most avoid us. If anything, they are more curious about you." "Great," Jack said. "I'll just consider myself the neighborhood attraction." The three of them moved in single file through the vibrant greenery. Lyra occasionally paused to collect samples, fronds that shimmered in her hand, seeds that pulsed gently with a bluish light. She handled each one with care, slipping them into small, clear containers in her satchel. "What's that one for?" Jack asked, watching as she gently plucked a glowing moss from a rock. "It contains compounds that promote cellular regeneration," Lyra said. "We use it in advanced healing treatments." "Kind of like your version of antibiotics?" Jack ventured. "Not exactly," Lyra replied. "But you could think of it as a natural restorative agent." Cale turned to them, his voice steady. "We are approaching the clearing. Stay alert." "More alerts, huh?" Jack said, shaking his head. "I thought you said it was safe." "It is safe," Cale said, his sharp gaze fixed ahead. "Relatively speaking." The group stepped into a broad clearing, the ground carpeted with soft, bioluminescent moss that glowed faintly under their feet. In the center stood a cluster of tall, spindly plants with bright, spherical flowers that pulsed in a slow rhythm. "These are what we came for," Lyra said, moving toward the flowers. They're rare and difficult to cultivate. Collecting them in the wild is the most efficient method. Let me help, Jack offered, stepping forward. Cale moved in beside him, showing him the correct way to cut the stems without damaging the plant's base. Jack followed his instructions, working carefully. You adapt quickly, Cale noted. Well, I don't want to mess up the rare plants that might save lives, Jack said. Plus, I'm not about to look useless next to you two. Lyra smiled, her hands moving deftly as she filled her satchel with the glowing blooms. You're hardly useless. It's good to have an extra set of hands. Jack glanced at her, a small grin tugging at his lips. I aim to please. As they worked, a faint sound in the distance made Cale tense. He straightened, his keen eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. What is it? Jack asked, his voice lowering instinctively. Something is approaching, Cale said quietly. Stay close. Lyra moved toward Jack, her expression calm but alert. It may only be a curious creature. Let's remain still and let it pass. Jack gripped the handle of his blade, one Cale had given him earlier, and kept his eyes on the trees. A moment later, a large, quadrupedal animal emerged, its skin gleaming like liquid metal. It paused, sniffing the air, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. Is that thing friendly? Jack asked under his breath. Neutral if we do not provoke it, Lyra whispered. Just stay calm. The creature's head tilted, its gaze sweeping over each of them before it turned and disappeared into the forest. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, that was something. Cale relaxed slightly. It was simply curious, as Lyra said. The animals here are not hostile unless threatened. Good to know, Jack said, feeling his pulse return to normal. I don't think I'd like to see what happens if we do threaten one. Lyra resumed collecting the flowers, her movements as fluid and precise as ever. Jack and Cale continued to help, their small team working efficiently in silence for a while. So, Jack began, breaking the quiet, how long have you two been doing this kind of work? Lyra glanced up. I've been a healer for many cycles. Cale, however, is relatively new to the field. I was assigned to assist her recently, Cale said. My background is more technical. Technical, huh? Jack said, raising an eyebrow. You're not a healer? No, Cale said. But our methods often require a blend of disciplines. I maintain the equipment, analyze data, and ensure our treatments are effective. Sounds like a fancy way of saying you're the engineer in the group, Jack said. Cale inclined his head slightly. If you wish to call it that. Lyra smiled. Cale's contributions are invaluable. Healing isn't only about treating injuries, it's also about understanding the processes and improving them. Got it, Jack said. I guess you're the brain, he's the tech guy, and I'm the guy trying not to get eaten by glowing forest creatures. Lyra laughed softly, and even Cale's lips twitched as though he was suppressing a smile. They worked together until their satchels were filled with the glowing flowers, and the clearing was left undisturbed, save for a few missing stems. As they began their journey back, Jack found himself walking between Lyra and Cale, their quiet camaraderie making the alien jungle feel just a little less intimidating. Chapter 6. Under the Moons. The trek back to the settlement had been long but uneventful, and now Jack found himself seated on a small rise overlooking the camp. Above, twin moons bathed the landscape in a cool, silver light, casting faint, shifting shadows on the ground. The alien world was quiet in a way Jack rarely experienced. No droning engines, no distant hum of city life. Just the soft rustle of the wind through unfamiliar leaves and the occasional chirp of some nocturnal creature. Lyra sat a few feet away, inspecting one of the glowing flowers they'd gathered earlier. She turned it delicately in her hands, the soft light reflecting in her large eyes. "This is the ideal time to process them," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The energy they contain is strongest under moonlight." Jack leaned back, propping himself on his elbows. "You sure it's not just because it looks cooler at night?" Lyra smiled faintly. "That may be a small part of it." From behind them came the quiet crunch of footsteps. Jack turned to see Cale approaching, carrying a container filled with tools and other supplies. "Everything is ready," Cale said as he set the container down between them. "We can begin the extraction process here." Lyra nodded, placing the flower onto a soft cloth. "Cale, would you prepare the stabilizing agent?" Cale knelt beside her, his long, agile fingers deftly handling the tools. Jack watched them work for a moment before speaking up. "So this is what you two do every day? Trek through alien jungles, gather glowing plants, and whip up medical miracles under a pair of moons?" Lyra glanced up. "It's part of what we do. The work is rewarding, even if it may seem monotonous at times." Jack chuckled. "I've had worse jobs. At least you're not sitting in a cubicle staring at a screen for hours." Cale raised an eyebrow as he mixed a pale, shimmering liquid in a small vial. "Your methods of labor sound inefficient." "You have no idea," Jack said. "And don't get me started on corporate meetings." Lyra tilted her head, curious. "What are these meetings for?" "Mostly to talk about things that could have been said in an email," Jack said with a smirk. "Trust me, you're not missing out." Cale handed the vial to Lyra, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange to think your kind operates so differently from ours. Yet you have achieved remarkable things." "Well," Jack said, "we get by. But I wouldn't mind trading some of those meetings for more nights like this. Quiet, peaceful. 2 moons overhead." He looked up, his eyes tracing the patterns of the stars. "Kind of makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Lyra followed his gaze. "It reminds us of how much we have yet to learn. Even after all this time, the universe still holds mysteries we can only begin to understand." Jack was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then he turned to her, a wry smile on his lips. "That sounded pretty profound. You should write that down." Lyra chuckled softly. "Perhaps I will." Cale, who had been focused on assembling another device, finally looked up. "The extraction process is ready. Shall we begin?" Lyra nodded, and the 3 of them worked in quiet harmony, each handling their tasks with precision. Jack wasn't sure how much help he really was. Lyra and Cale clearly knew what they were doing, but he followed their instructions as best he could, passing tools, holding vials steady, and keeping an eye on the fragile flowers they'd collected. When the process was complete, Lyra carefully stored the extracted compounds in sealed containers. She placed them back in the satchel and set it aside. The task done, she leaned back against the rise, her face illuminated by the moon's soft glow. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her tone warm. "Your assistance was valuable." Jack shrugged, sitting down beside her. "I don't know how much help I really was, but I'm glad I could pitch in." Cale stood, dusting off his hands. "Your willingness to participate is more important than the outcome. It is not common for someone unfamiliar with our methods to integrate so quickly." "I'm just trying not to mess things up," Jack said. "But I appreciate the vote of confidence." Cale nodded, his silver-toned skin catching the light, and then stepped away to tend to the equipment. Jack turned to Lyra, who was gazing up at the stars again. "What's it like?" he asked after a moment. "Living here, doing what you do?" Lyra thought for a moment before answering. It is fulfilling to know that our work eases suffering, that we can offer aid to those who need it. And yet, it can also be lonely. Our world is vast, our settlements scattered. We do not see many faces, hear many voices. Jack nodded. I get that. Even back on Earth, in the middle of a crowd, you can still feel alone sometimes. Lyra glanced at him, her gaze soft. And yet, you seem to carry that solitude well. Yeah, well, I've had practice, Jack said. You get used to it. But I have to admit, it's nice having some company out here, even if the company is two aliens who know way more than I do. You're not entirely wrong, Lyra said, her smile returning. But you bring something unique to our group. Jack tilted his head, curious. What's that? Curiosity, Lyra said. And a certain warmth. Jack didn't know how to respond at first. He glanced at her again, and this time their eyes met and lingered. For a brief moment, the vastness of the alien world seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them under the twin moons. Chapter 7. The Conflict. The camp felt quieter than usual that morning, the air heavier somehow. Jack was used to the routine by now. Early rises, breakfast in the communal area, then a briefing with Lyra and Cale on the day's tasks. But today, the usual rhythm was disrupted. Lyra sat with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unusually guarded, while Cale leaned against the wall, his silver-toned features more tense than Jack had ever seen. "What's going on?" Jack asked, taking a seat at the table across from Lyra. She exchanged a glance with Cale before speaking. "A delegation from the Central Council has arrived. They wish to speak with us." "Okay," Jack said, his brow furrowing. "That doesn't sound so bad." "They've expressed concern about your presence here," Cale said bluntly. "They believe it may compromise the security of our work." Jack blinked. "Compromise it? I've done everything you've asked, and then some. What's the problem?" Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her voice calm but firm. "It's not about what you've done. It's about what they fear you might bring. They worry that your species' reputation, its history of conflict, could disrupt our way of life." Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. "So they're judging me based on what humans have done in the past? That's not exactly fair." Cale's eyes narrowed. "They do not see it that way. They see it as a precaution. One human here could lead to more. More could lead to unwanted influences." Lyra nodded. "They fear that if we allow you to stay, it sets a precedent. It's not about you personally, Jack. It's about the unknown." "Well, if they're so worried about the unknown," Jack said, "maybe they should actually try talking to me instead of just making assumptions." "You will have the opportunity to speak," Lyra said. "They have requested a meeting with all three of us this evening. Until then, it's best that we continue as normal. The more cooperative we appear, the better." Jack sighed. "Fine. But I'm not going to sit there and let them treat me like some ticking time bomb. I'll explain who I am, what I've done, and why I'm here. If they still can't deal with it, that's on them." Cale glanced at Lyra, then back at Jack. "You should be prepared. They will not be easily swayed." "I'll handle it," Jack said. "Now, what's on the agenda for the rest of the day?" Lyra outlined the tasks: inventory checks, reviewing the latest batch of harvested materials, and testing a new stabilization compound. Jack listened, nodding along, though his mind kept drifting to the upcoming meeting. He couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and determination. He'd done everything they'd asked, and now he had to prove himself all over again. The day's work went by in a blur, with Jack, Lyra, and Cale moving from one task to the next. They worked in near silence, the weight of the impending council meeting hanging over them. By the time evening arrived, the tension was palpable. The council's representatives had set up in a larger structure at the edge of the camp. When the three of them entered, Jack was met with the sight of 5 Ataraxians seated in a semicircle, their faces unreadable. They wore long, flowing garments that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and their eyes glowed faintly, a reminder of how different they were from him. One of the representatives, an older male with deep-set eyes, spoke first. "You are the human," he said, his tone neutral. "Yes," Jack replied, standing straight. "My name's Jack Manning. I'm here because your people saved my life after my ship crashed. Since then, I've been doing my best to help out and learn about your ways." "And what do you intend to do now that you have recovered?" the older Ataraxian asked. Jack took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I intend to keep helping, to work with Lyra and Cale, to contribute in any way I can. I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here to learn and to help." Another council member, a woman with silvery-green skin, spoke next. "Your species is known for its aggression, its wars. How can we trust that you will not bring those tendencies here?" "I'm not here to fight," Jack said firmly. "I'm here because I've seen how your people live, how you work together. I respect that. That's not something I want to disrupt. It's something I want to understand." Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but authoritative. "Jack has proven himself willing to adapt and cooperate. He has shown respect for our ways and has made meaningful contributions to our efforts. He is not a threat." Cale nodded. "He has worked alongside us without incident. While his presence here is unusual, it has not caused harm." The older council member regarded Jack with narrowed eyes. "You speak well, human, but words are easy. Actions speak louder. And what action would you like to see?" Jack asked. "What can I do to prove I'm not a problem?" There was a long pause. The council members exchanged glances, their glowing eyes flickering faintly. Finally, the older Ataraxian spoke again. "Continue your work under the supervision of Lyra and Cale. We will observe and evaluate. If you prove yourself over time, our concerns may be eased. But know this, if we see any sign of disruption, we will act swiftly." Jack nodded. "Fair enough. I'll do whatever it takes." The meeting ended with no handshakes or formalities, only a nod from the council as the three of them left. Once outside, Jack exhaled deeply, the tension finally releasing from his shoulders. "Well, that went about as well as I could have hoped," he said. "They have agreed to give you a chance," Lyra said. "That is more than I expected." Cale placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his grip firm. "Prove them wrong." "I intend to," Jack said. "Let's get back to work." Chapter 8. A New Dawn. The council's scrutiny weighed heavily on Jack, but he stuck to his word. Over the following weeks, he worked tirelessly alongside Lyra and Cale. Together, they cultivated rare medicinal plants, refined healing compounds, and maintained the delicate balance of the alien settlement's operations. Jack's human approach to problem-solving, paired with his growing understanding of Ataraxian methods, made him an unexpected asset. One morning, as the three of them packed up their equipment after another long night of processing new samples, Cale broke the silence. "You've adapted more quickly than I anticipated." Jack glanced over, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Was that your way of saying I'm not entirely useless?" Cale's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "It was a statement of fact." "High praise," Jack said with a chuckle. "I'll take it." Lyra stepped over, carrying a small container of the processed material. "The Council has taken note of your progress. They've requested another meeting." Jack arched an eyebrow. "And is this meeting going to end with me getting the boot?" "No," Lyra said. "I believe they intend to discuss a more permanent arrangement. If they approve, you may be allowed to remain here as a formal contributor." "Well, that's a step up from being a suspicious outsider," Jack said. "When is this meeting?" "Tonight," Cale replied. "We'll go together." Jack nodded. "All right. Let's get this over with." That evening, the council chamber was much as it had been before, but the atmosphere felt less tense. The same 5 council members were present, their glowing eyes fixed on Jack as he stood before them. Lyra and Cale flanked him on either side. The elder council member began. "You have proven yourself to be diligent and cooperative, human. We acknowledge the efforts you have made to integrate with our community." "Thank you," Jack said, keeping his tone steady. "I've done my best to learn from your ways and contribute wherever I can." "You have also demonstrated the ability to adapt," the elder continued. "This is a quality we value. However, the question remains, what are your long-term intentions?" Jack paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to keep working with Lyra and Cale. I want to learn more about your people, your methods, and see if I can help bridge the gap between our species. If you'll have me, I'm willing to stay and contribute as long as I'm needed." The council members exchanged glances. Finally, the elder spoke again. "You may remain under the guidance of Lyra and Cale. Your position will be recognized, and you will be given the tools necessary to continue your work. But know that you are still an outsider. Full acceptance will take time." Jack inclined his head. "Understood. Thank you for giving me this chance." As the council adjourned, Lyra and Cale led Jack out into the cool night air. For the first time, Jack allowed himself a moment to breathe freely. The faint hum of the settlement's energy systems mixed with the chirping of distant creatures, creating a strangely soothing backdrop. "Well," Jack said, looking between them, "I guess that means I'm officially one of the team." "It's a step in the right direction," Lyra said, a hint of a smile on her face. "You've earned their trust, but you'll need to continue proving yourself." Cale nodded. "They will watch closely, but you've shown you can handle scrutiny." Jack leaned back against a low wall, gazing up at the twin moons. "You know, when I crashed here, I didn't think I'd end up working with 2 aliens to heal the sick and build bridges between our people. It's been unexpected." Lyra tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. "And yet it feels right, as if it was meant to be." Cale glanced at her, then at Jack. "It is rare for our people to connect with another species in this way. Your presence has been unique." Jack chuckled softly. "Unique. I'll take it." The 3 of them stood there in companionable silence, the weight of the day lifting as they looked out over the settlement. The challenges weren't over, but for the first time, Jack felt a sense of belonging. Together they had created something new, a fragile but growing connection that might just change both their worlds for the better.